The screaming came from the room down the hall, less than 3 hours into my wedding night, still wearing my mehndi, still smelling of jasmine from the ceremony hours earlier. I found my mother-in-law, Farida, curled against the bedroom wall, one hand pressed against her cheek, while my father-in-law, Aslam, stood over her with his fist still raised, breathing hard, his wedding Sherwani jacket discarded on the floor beside him like he'd shed his public performance of respectability the moment the guests had gone home. I didn't think. I stepped between them, my back to Farida, facing a man I'd met exactly 4 times before marrying his son that afternoon. "Get out of here," Aslam snarled. "This isn't your business." "She's bleeding," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "This is absolutely my business now." That's when my husband Rayyan appeared in the doorway behind me, and instead of stepping toward his father, instead of doing anything to stop what I'd just witnessed, he grabbed my arm and slapped me hard enough that my ears rang. "Don't interfere in family matters," he said, his voice eerily calm, like he'd said this exact sentence before, to someone else, in some other room, on some other night. I turned toward him fully, adrenaline replacing whatever shock might have otherwise paralyzed me, and grabbed his hand as he reached for me again. What happened in the next 90 seconds would determine everything about the rest of my marriage, though none of us standing in that room yet understood exactly how far the consequences would extend by morning. My name is Sabina Rayman, and 6 hours earlier, I'd married Rayyan Chaudhry in a ceremony surrounded by 400 guests, believing I understood the family I was joining, based on months of careful courtship, dinners at their beautiful house, and the particular warmth Aslam and Farida had shown me during our engagement period. I want you to understand something about how thoroughly that warmth had concealed what actually existed beneath it. Farida had always seemed composed during our visits, gracious and welcoming, occasionally moving with a careful stiffness I'd attributed to an old back injury she'd mentioned once, in passing, during an early dinner. I'd never once suspected that stiffness might have origins considerably darker than a simple medical condition. Rayyan, throughout our courtship, had presented himself as thoughtful, attentive, nothing like the man who just slapped me in his parents' hallway. Looking back now, I recognized small warning signs I'd dismissed too easily at the time. The way he sometimes went quiet and distant after phone calls with his father. The careful, controlled way he discussed his parents' marriage, always describing it as traditional and old-fashioned whenever I asked direct questions about their relationship dynamic. I'd married into a family whose surface presentation had been constructed with considerable care, a performance sophisticated enough that even months of dating hadn't fully revealed what actually happened once the public audience disappeared and the doors closed for the night. Grabbing Rayyan's wrist as he reached toward me again that night, feeling something cold and clarifying settle over the earlier shock, I understood immediately that whatever version of my husband I'd fallen in love with during our courtship existed alongside something considerably more dangerous, something his family had apparently normalized long before I'd ever entered the picture. I twisted his wrist hard, using training from the self-defense classes I'd taken years earlier during college, training I genuinely never expected to need against my own husband on our wedding night. Rayyan's fingers snapped audibly as I twisted his wrist and pushed his hand backward against the door frame. 3 distinct cracks that made him scream and stumble backward, cradling his hand against his chest, his earlier calm authority completely shattered. "You broke my hand," he said, staring at me with something between disbelief and rage, as though the possibility of consequences for hitting me had genuinely never occurred to him. "You slapped me," I said, my voice steadier than my racing heart suggested it should be, "on our wedding night, while your father was beating your mother in the next room." Aslam, momentarily distracted by his son's screaming, made the mistake of stepping toward me as well, and I positioned myself firmly between him and Farida, who remained crumpled against the wall, watching this entire scene unfold with an expression I recognized immediately. The particular resignation of someone who'd witnessed violence become normalized in her own home for far too many years to summon genuine surprise anymore. "I'm taking her to the hospital," I said, my voice leaving no room for negotiation. "Either someone calls for a car, or I'm calling the police myself, and I'm certain the responding officers will have questions about both her injuries and Rayyan's broken fingers." The mention of police seemed to finally penetrate whatever adrenaline-fueled confidence Aslam had been operating under. His posture shifted, defensive rather than aggressive, understanding that whatever control he'd maintained over his household for years had just been fundamentally challenged by a daughter-in-law he'd clearly underestimated. "There's no need for police," he said quickly. "This was a private family disagreement." "Your wife has visible bruising and possibly a fractured cheekbone," I said. "That's not a disagreement. That's assault, and I'm not staying silent about it simply because it's inconvenient for your family's reputation." I helped Farida to her feet gently, understanding from her flinch that touching her wrong side caused genuine pain, and guided her toward the door, leaving both men standing in stunned silence. The emergency room doctor who examined Farida confirmed what I'd suspected, a hairline fracture along her cheekbone, along with older, partially healed injuries that suggested this violence had been occurring for considerably longer than just that single night. "These fractures on her ribs," the doctor said quietly, showing me the imaging results while Farida rested nearby, sedated for pain, "are at different stages of healing. Some quite recent, others several months old at minimum." I sat with that information, understanding the full scope of what I'd stumbled into hours after my own wedding, a pattern of abuse that had apparently continued silently for years, hidden behind the same carefully constructed family image that had convinced me, during our courtship, that I was marrying into a warm, traditional family rather than one built on decades of concealed violence. Farida woke briefly around 3 in the morning, finding me still sitting beside her hospital bed. "You shouldn't have gotten involved," she said quietly, though something in her expression suggested gratitude alongside the warning. "Oslam won't let this go easily." "I couldn't just walk past that room," I said. "I'm not built that way." "I've been married to him for 32 years, she said. "I learned a long time ago that involvement only makes things more dangerous, for everyone." "That's exactly the problem," I said gently. 32 years of silence hasn't made things safer. It's made them worse, hidden enough that nobody outside your household ever had the chance to actually stop it. She didn't respond to that immediately, though I could see something shifting behind her exhausted expression, the beginning of a question she perhaps hadn't allowed herself to seriously consider in decades, whether continued silence actually protected her, or simply protected the family's reputation at her direct, physical expense. I stayed with Farida until morning, uncertain exactly what I'd be walking back into once we finally left that hospital, but entirely certain that whatever came next, I wasn't prepared to simply pretend the previous night hadn't happened. We returned to the Chaudhry house around 10 that morning, exhausted, Farida's face swollen despite the pain medication, to find both Oslam and Rayyan waiting in the living room, Rayyan's hand wrapped in a temporary splint, both men wearing expressions that suggested overnight strategizing rather than genuine remorse. "We need to discuss how to handle this situation," Oslam said, his tone carrying the particular authority of a man accustomed to controlling every narrative within his household. "Farida will tell people she fell. Rayyan's hand was injured helping move furniture. This stays within the family." I felt Farida tense beside me, though she said nothing, decades of practiced silence apparently still exerting powerful influence even now. "No," I said clearly. "That's not what's happening." Rayyan stepped forward, his expression shifting between anger and something like genuine confusion, as though he still fundamentally didn't understand why his actions the previous night had generated consequences rather than simply being absorbed into the household's usual pattern. "Sabina, you're my wife now," he said. "This family's business is your business too. You need to understand that some things stay private. I understand that you slapped me for trying to stop your father from beating your mother," I said. "I understand that this has apparently been happening for years, based on the injuries the hospital documented last night. I'm not staying silent about any of that, regardless of what you consider family business." Oslam's composure finally cracked slightly. "What exactly are you planning to do?" "I already filed a police report this morning, before we left the hospital," I said, watching both men's faces shift into genuine alarm for the first time since we'd returned. "The doctor documented everything, including evidence suggesting a pattern of abuse extending back years. That report is now part of an official record that neither of you controls." The silence that followed carried weight neither man had apparently anticipated needing to prepare for. The following weeks unfolded with legal and social consequences neither Oslam nor Rayyan had genuinely believed possible the morning after my wedding night. The police investigation, supported by hospital documentation of both Farida's current and historical injuries, led to formal domestic violence charges against Oslam, charges that Farida, after considerable hesitation and several long conversations with me and eventually with a domestic violence counselor, ultimately agreed to support rather than retract. Rayyan faced his own separate charges for the assault against me, though the broken fingers he'd sustained during his attempted second strike became, somewhat ironically, evidence supporting my claim of self-defense rather than working against me. I filed for an annulment 3 weeks after our wedding, a legal process complicated by the short duration of our marriage but ultimately straightforward given clear evidence of domestic violence occurring within hours of the ceremony itself. Rayyan's family, once so carefully composed and welcoming during our courtship, revealed themselves through this process to be considerably more concerned with reputation management than genuine accountability, several relatives attempting to pressure me privately towards silence and reconciliation, offers I declined without exception. Farida moved into her sister's home during the legal proceedings, beginning, slowly and cautiously, to build a life separate from 32 years of concealed violence. She still calls me occasionally. Our relationship evolved into something neither of us could have predicted that first night. Not mother-in-law and daughter-in-law anymore, but something more like unexpected allies bound together by that single, unavoidable moment when silence finally became impossible to maintain. I think about that wedding night often, the version of my future I'd imagined walking into that house, compared to what I actually discovered within hours of the ceremony ending. I don't regret intervening, despite everything that unfolded afterward, despite losing a marriage I genuinely believed, hours earlier, might last a lifetime. So I'll ask you what I've asked myself since that night. If you discovered violence hidden behind a family's carefully maintained public image, would you have stayed silent to protect the marriage you just entered? Or would you have intervened immediately, the way I did, regardless of the consequences that intervention might bring?